Hello, I'm Malcolm Getz here at Fort Negley Park, and I look forward to talking with you about fossils. We're going to be working with a timeline represented by a cloth that we have hanging on the wall here. You may have a similar cloth which you could put on the floor or otherwise lay out so that you can look at the timeline and work with it for yourself. We have 4 cards which we're going to look at to designate parts of the timeline. On the far right is a card marked Today, and it is a photograph of the downtown skyline of Nashville. We're going to then use the timeline to walk back in time through history. Each inch of the timeline represents 20 million years of time. So as we're moving back, going to the left, we're going all the way to the time when the Earth formed, 4,540 million years ago. The Earth formed at the same time as the rest of the solar system. The Sun and the other planets all came together at the same time. After about 170 million years, the Earth cooled enough to form crystals and to allow rain to fall to create oceans and lakes. The third card that we have is titled First Life on Earth, and it shows blue-green algae. Blue-green algae grows in ponds and still water all around the Earth, and it has been living on the Earth for 3,200 million years, and it's likely to be living here for many millions of years to come. The appearance of the blue-green algae is the beginning of the process of putting oxygen into the Earth's atmosphere. Our fourth card is titled Nashville Rocks Formed, and it has a photograph of the underwater creatures, animals that lived in this area when the fossils were created that ultimately led to the fossils here at Fort Negley. One of the fossils looks like a seashell because it is a seashell. It's called a brachiopod. And students who come to Fort Negley can go to the rock pile that is here at the park and look for fossils, and one of the fossils are the brachiopod. Another kind of fossil is called a crinoid. The crinoid anchors itself to the bottom of the sea, and it grows a stalk which has cylindrical rings around it, and those rings are easy to spot in the fossil pile. The top of the crinoid has a feathery structure that the crinoid uses to pull food out of the seawater to feed itself.
Hi, I'm Molly Miller, and I'm glad to be here at the outcrop of rock at Fort Negley. This rock accumulated over millions of years all over Nashville and Middle Tennessee. And in fact, it accumulated as a sedimentary rock in layers. The oldest layer is down there at the bottom, and it was deposited first. The youngest layer, right here, is on top. And it was deposited probably 1 million years later. We don't know exactly how much time this represents. But we can say that what we're going to do today is to look at the fossils that are in these rocks. In fact, these were the earliest inhabitants of Nashville. And they give a record of what the life was like over 400 million years ago in what is like right now Nashville, and what the environment was like as well. So we're not going to go through every fossil that you might find, and there's a lot of them in these rocks and all over Nashville. But what we are going to do is concentrate on 5 most common kinds of fossils. But remember, these all lived in about 460 million years ago to 360 million years ago, and you can see that on the timeline. There are 5 common fossils that you can find mostly here at Fort Negley or almost anywhere in Nashville. Let's go through and talk about each of these kinds of fossils. All of them have modern representatives that live in the ocean today, right? So they lived in these, and first is colonial corals. This is a coral head, and it's made up of many, many, many little polyps. Each one of these is a little polyp, and each polyp has tentacles with real zinger stinging cells on it. And so when a little tiny animal floats by, it nabs it and stings it and sticks it down into its digestive area. The colony is made by many, many different polyps, and each polyp secretes a hard calcite, that's a mineral, skeleton. When the polyp dies, it decays, and it leaves this hard coral skeleton behind. This is what we find as fossils. Now, Fort Negley has unbelievable fossil corals. I'm going to go right up here behind me. Here's this coral head. See, it's really big. It goes all the way around and probably goes way into the rock as well. That was a coral colony, and each of these little tiny tubes housed a polyp, and the polyps kept dividing in half and adding more polyps, and it grew really large. Even though there were big storms, it never knocked over this coral reef. It was growing upwards like this, and to this day, it hasn't moved. 460 million years it has sat there without moving. Some of the smaller coral heads and coral colonies weren't so lucky, and you can come to Fort Negley and look and see which ones were turned over by waves, probably big waves during hurricanes, and didn't stay upright and growing healthily. This is fossil number 2 of our 5 common fossils. These are solitary corals. These are the polyps that are just pretty much like those in the colonial corals, except that instead of living in a big colony, they live in their separate calcite boxes that look sort of like horns. When they're alive, they sting prey, little things floating by in the ocean, sting it, subdue it, and stick it down this hole into where they are digested. When the polyp dies, it decays, and it's left with the hard shell that remains as a fossil. So those are solitary corals, and some of them that you can find in the fossil pile are really tiny, even smaller than that. Maybe they were only alive for 4 or 5 months while they started to grow after they attached to the bottom of the ocean. Our third fossil are crinoids. They live in the ocean too. It looks like a sea lily. It is called a sea lily. It looks like a flower, but it's not at all. Really what it is like an animal with a stalk, and this would be like a starfish on its back, wiggling its little legs. But it's not, obviously, it doesn't look just like a starfish. But this is what a crinoid looks like, and guess how they get food? They trap food by putting this upper part into the current that might be flowing by and trapping little food particles and then putting them into its mouth, which is down in here. These are alive today in the deeper parts of the ocean, and they really do look like flowers. But all of the skeleton of a crinoid or a starfish actually is secreted underneath a thin layer of like skin on the outside. And they're secreted as individual pieces or crystals of the mineral calcite. When they die, the pieces all scatter and fall apart. And commonly what we find as crinoid fossils, and this is what you're going to find, are segments of the stalk that are made up of stacked pieces of discs of calcite. So crinoids are really the most common type of fossil that you might find. Our fourth type of fossil are called brachiopods. Brachiopods sort of look like clams. They don't live in a colony, they just have two shells. Here's 1 and 2. And most of the space between the two shells is made of this filmy ring of tentacles. And those tentacles, guess what they do? Yep, they actually have little cilia, things that move quickly. What that does is to create water currents that suck in water into between the shells, and then the ring of tentacles filters food particles from the ocean. And they pick only particles that can be easily digested. The brachiopod just sits there. It only moves to open and close its shells a little bit. And you can see this isn't even open all that much. Now, each fossil brachiopod is about 1 inch across, but there's lots and lots of different kinds. They changed over time, and what they changed to do is become more and more efficient at doing almost nothing. They are the most abundant animals that we know as fossils for 200 million years after about 460 million years. And they all live in the ocean again. Our last common fossil is one that again is a colony. They're called bryozoans, and then most of them live in the ocean today. They are the smallest, they hold the world's record as the smallest complex little animal of all. And it's because they live in colonies, but the polyps, the individual polyps that you can see here, are tiny, 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 less than the size of the tip of a pencil. Today, there are many, many living bryozoans, so that's how we know how they behave. There's lots of them in very shallow waters of the ocean where they look like sort of scummy lumps of seaweed. And sometimes if you find a shell, they will have bryozoan colonies encrusted on them. These are what, down here on the bottom, we have what fossil bryozoans look like. If you get a close-up of a part of a bryozoan colony, each dot here, each little circle is the house of calcite that was secreted by an individual polyp, as you can see up here. This is a tiny, small piece of a coral colony. Here's a bigger piece of a coral colony. And on this piece, there's probably 10,000 individual little polyps. So these are they live in colonies, like corals can, but they're much, much smaller than corals. And the colony usually are pieces of broken rock. They look like twigs, blades. And the polyp houses, you have to look really carefully to see them. They're tiny black dots. And these are so abundant all over Nashville area. So these are the 5 most common types of fossils that you will see. There were some animals that did a lot more, and they had eyes and they moved around a lot, but they're not as common, and you're not as likely to find them as you are to find one of these 5. These include these little scurriers. They look kind of like, and they're related to pill bugs, and they had eyes, and they scurried around and dug into the sediment and ate mud. These are called trilobites. And then the predators were these things called nautiloids. They're relatives of today's living squid, and they were all predators. We're not sure what they ate, because really, if you eat a brachiopod, you don't get much. It's hardly worth the effort to eat it. But anyhow, some of them grew to be 30 feet long. And the mystery is, what did they eat? We really don't know. But this picture is really neat because it shows all the different kinds, the 5 different kinds of bryozoans, solitary corals, a coral, colonial coral, and brachiopods and bryozoans. Be careful to note what letter was on or in your fossil bag, because you're not all going to get the same fossil. Was it A, B, C, D, or E? Remember that fossil letter. Also, your fossil may not be whole. It may be a broken piece, or it may be just one of the calcite plates of crinoids. The fossil may be tiny. Then what you do is to draw your fossil in a box on the back of the data sheet, and also answer the questions. And think about, how did this animal eat? What was it like where it was living? And so answer those questions, and then see what your friends' fossils are as well. There is a pile right next to the visitor center of fossil-rich rocks provided by Vulcan Materials Company. And there's so many fossils there, and you can take all you want from there, and they'll just bring more. So please come, including this Saturday, to the Colossal Fossil Day, when we're going to have lots of activities, and you can see the corals, and you can collect fossils for yourself.